speaker is Greta. Greta's experiences range from working as a conservation advocate for environmental nonprofit organizations to serving as a field contract biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. She is the author of numerous reports and publications on the impact of livestock grazing, riparian restoration, and rare plants in both the United States and Mexico.
All right, so I'm going to talk about grazing in Arizona's deserts. And first, I just wanted to say that I wanted to dedicate the talk to Joe Feller. And it feels weird to be in Phoenix. That's right. I need both. It feels weird to be in Phoenix talking about grazing advocacy without Joe in the room. So I wanted to bring him in the room today. All right, so despite having been a student of the anti-grazing ideologue Tom Fleischner at Prescott College, I actually came to grazing impacts sort of through the back door, and I was very happy in 2002 to be at Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument studying this cool little plant. Whoop, this is technology, this one. It's a very cool rare cactus that grows like a little vine, and I was there from January to September of 2002 looking at the distribution of this plant. And it had previously been studied by no less than the great park ranger Ed Abbey down there. So I was really happy to go out in the field and look for this neat night-blooming Cirrus. And this map doesn't matter, so don't try to understand it. But what I wanted to, the sort of point of it is that originally, the plants were only known from these two hillsides when it was first discovered on the monument in the 1960s. It was only known on these two hillsides. Here's the US-Mexico border. This is the park, Mexico down here. And when I went out and studied it, I went back to all the old locations, and then I did surveys all through this area looking for more of the species. And in fact, we found more species over here. And originally, it was thought to be a plant that only grew underneath trees on rocky hillsides. In the 60s, that's how it was described. But when we went back out, it's not true. It actually occurs in all of these other places. But then there's a lot of places that it doesn't occur. And so once I'd done the field work, I went back to a geospatial analysis here. And where it doesn't occur is the areas that have been heavily grazed, which was right here around a ranch house. And over here, where there had been such heavy grazing and severe erosion that the Park Service in the 50s had actually come in and done range restoration and put up all kinds of diversion spreaders. So what we've learned in 2002 is that the distribution of this really rare, cool cactus is still being affected by livestock grazing that was taking place before the park was established in 1936 and when the grazing was finally ended in the 1970s. So that's you know, to me, that was a really profound revelation. And so that concluded, and we have a paper out on this, and the references at the end. That study concluded that the cessation of livestock grazing likely allowed for range expansion. No longer did this plant have to go just under trees and on rocky hillsides. Now it could inhabit a broader area where the cows previously had been trampling and eating it. And also probably that lower number of freezing days allowed for its expansion. There had been a previous study that talked about livestock grazing on organ pipe having a profound long-term effect on vegetation resources. So here's a species that kind of ended up giving that example. And it really blew me away that even though there were no cows after 1978 on this National Park Service monument, there's still cow trails everywhere. You could still follow them around the park. So I started to see that livestock grazing has really shaped the desert. At the same time I was doing my study, or the year previous, the Sonoran Desert National Monument was designated. This was one of Clinton's monuments on Bureau of Land Management lands. And it's 500,000 acres just west of here. I'll show you a map in a second. But this proclamation that established this monument did something really unique. And what it did was it recognized that grazing was having an adverse effect on all of the lands south of Interstate 8. And I'll show you a map in a second. So all of that was going to be closed to grazing. And on the northern portion of the allotment of the monument, they made a little bit of a compromise, and they said, grazing on the northern portion can only continue insofar as it's found not to interfere with the paramount purpose of the monument, which is protecting the monument objects. Hard to sometimes think of wildlife and plants as objects, but that's the agency speak. And so in 2001, the Bureau of Land Management wanted to figure this out whether it was compatible or not. And so they hired the Nature Conservancy and a group called Pacific Biodiversity Institute to do comprehensive studies of livestock grazing impacts on the monument. Here's a picture of the monument. Here's the Interstate 8. This whole area was closed. And then these remaining allotments, there's 5 of them up here, remained kind of in play. And this is the area that the BLM needed to decide whether it was harming the monument objects or not. So first, here's a list of the monument objects, quite a bit of wildlife. I am a vegetation ecologist, so I like to consider wildlife to be just plant distribution mechanisms. But Pacific Biodiversity Institute did over 750 in-person days on the monument, and did 5 reports, and they did 320 plots. They did, extensive sampling, statistical design. They designed this study with BLM and the Nature Conservancy to go out and check, the effects of the distribution of perennial grasses in relation to livestock, water tanks, things like that. And every one of the reports showed grazing's having a profound influence. You can see that, the distance to grazing water is the cause of degraded grasslands. There's an increase in exotic plants, higher levels of bare ground. Just basically every study across the board, including noting that sometimes it was really hard to do these vegetation studies because there was nothing left. You couldn't identify the grasses because the grasses were gone. And most profoundly, 97% of the creosote burr sage community, which is the majority of the monument in the lowlands, was exhibited ecological degradation directly due to livestock grazing. So the majority of the monument, the major ecosystem of the monument, is degraded by livestock grazing. And this, they went back and forth with BLM and tried to make their reports sound more neutral, but this was the outcome. And the lead researcher basically said, hey man, this place is in such bad shape that unless you get the cows off, it will never recover. So, you at least need to give it a break. At the same time, the Nature Conservancy was conducting a review of the scientific literature. And what they did was they went through every monument object and they did a review of all the literature that related to grazing in those particular species. And what they found, and they also looked at grazing management styles, and you hear rest rotation and deferred rotation and stuff like that. So what the Nature Conservancy found is none of those models actually fits the Sonoran Desert ecosystem because of our weird rain and pulse cycles, things like that. And that no currently described approach, including continuous grazing or any specialized grazing system, is completely applicable to the Sonoran Desert. And they said even ephemeral grazing, which is just when it greens up, dumping the cows out there, might not be appropriate. And here's what they did for every species. They did this chart, and they just looked at the literature, and they just evaluated whether it said it was a positive effect, a negative effect, or a neutral effect. And for some of these species that have positive effects, like the leopard frogs, they said, well, grazing actually has a positive effect on leopard frogs because it builds stock tanks, so it's actually improving, giving them more habitat. It's not an improvement over the species' natural habitat, but nonetheless, it had a positive effect on the population. Or like desert tortoise had a mixed review, and it's because desert tortoise one time was seen eating cow dung, and so that was considered an increased forage base. So take this with a grain of salt is my point. But the main conclusion was that in general, livestock are alter the vegetation of wildlife habitat, and that the most important impact that they found, the most clear, it's bad, impact was on native bighorn sheep, which is incidentally a protected monument object. So between Pacific Biodiversity's work and the Nature Conservancy's work, after 5 years, it would be kind of obvious, right, that they can't keep grazing a monument where the goal is the paramount purpose of protecting the monument objects, right? Oh, not so much. They're not called the Bureau of Livestock Management and actually what I wanted to say is if I've offended any agency folks in the room with this slide, we're offering a 10% discount membership to Western Watersheds Project to salve your wounds. But anyway, the Bureau of Livestock Management, the Bureau of Land Management, is quite well known for placating the ranchers. So instead, they said, oh, yeah, we designed those studies and we agreed to it and we spent all this money, but those weren't peer reviewed. And so what we really need to do is go back and do our own qualitative research and our own kind of plots that you just sort of go out and look and estimate things. And to do this, they discarded the vast majority of the Pacific Biodiversity Institute plots, the ones that were within the 1 kilometer of water, because Pacific Biodiversity had done a stratified random sampling, and they discarded all of the ones that they knew would have livestock impacts. They compared the areas south of the interstate with areas north of the interstate without acknowledging that ongoing and trespass grazing was continuing to happen south of the interstate. And they used the rangeland health conditions, which is a very general picture of how BLM assesses ecological sites, as proxy data for whether the habitat for monument objects was going to be okay. So basically, they didn't really look at the habitat needs of specific species, like going out and measuring specific cover, but they said, you know, generally, if it's good enough for BLM, it's good enough for Cactus, Phrygianus pygmaeal. And lo and behold, when this big document on the floor here came out in 2012, they found that only, in fact, 3.4% or 9,000 acres of the monument was being degraded by livestock. Quite a difference. And so basically grazing continues on most of the monument, and there's a little nuance with the areas they could actually close versus the ones they need to keep open. But you can see out of 500,000 acres, BLM was willing to admit that only 8,500 were affected by cows. So now what I wanted to say, how am I doing for time, John? Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so now my question is, how did they get there, right? When I'd been studying this stuff for 10 years, and this plan comes out and says only 3.4% of the monument is degraded because of livestock, like anybody who's been to the monument can tell you that's not true. So I started looking at the various drafts, and this is back in the project record. This is not in the documents, but if you go back. So in the first draft, they set these numbers for vegetation canopy cover and percent grass composition, and they tested all of their plots against these numbers based on the ecological sites. Well, by draft 2, they figured, okay, some of them aren't making it. We need to lower the vegetation cover. And so without any explanation, it goes down 25%, right? Now they only need to meet 12%, or on sandy loam. And coincidentally, a lot of the plots had like 13%, right? So between draft 1 and draft 2 now, we've lowered the bar and more plots get over it. By the time the final land health evaluation came out, they were lowered even more to 40%. Or, you know, this one, the saguaro. Saguaros is one of the monument objects. It was lowered to only needing to be 0.96. How do you get 0.96 of a saguaro is another question. 0.96 per 12 square meters. So anyway, this, you know, 15%, all of these changes. And one of the things about NEPA that's very important is the agency is allowed to do this, but they need a basis for doing it, and they need to disclose it through NEPA, and they don't have a basis, and they didn't disclose it. So I started thinking, you know, they just keep lowering the bar in every iteration, and more things pass. So what next? How did they do that? Well, they ignored some of the peer reviewers, which is basically some peer reviewers said, you can't just, if you're looking at livestock impacts, you can't just exclude all the plots that have livestock impacts, because they just did that right at the outset. Of the 340 plots, they got rid of most of them. And then another peer reviewer said, your methods are the equivalent of shooting a 19th century canyon to shoot a sparrow on the far horizon at night, which they ignored him too. But they did listen to this one peer reviewer, who shall remain not nameless, Rex Piper, who said that if you adopted a different methodology, well, gosh, there'd be fewer cases of the standards not being met. So BLM decided, oh yeah, okay, let's do that. So they applied the 80% rule. So by the time they were determining whether every plot was going to meet the objectives, they multiplied this by 80%. So if you had something that had been a 34% objective, now it only needed to be 27.2 in order to meet. So you see what's happening here, right? The bar is getting even lower for them to jump across it. But nonetheless, there were still 130,000 acres, nearly 130,000 acres, that weren't meeting the standards. They couldn't lower the bar far enough to get over half of the grazed lands over it. So what they did was they decided, but was it the cows? Was it the cows that caused the problem? Because we don't have to eliminate grazing unless it's cows. So they did use pattern mapping, and they looked at livestock use in 2009 and said if cows didn't eat more than 40% of the key species in 2009, then it wasn't the cow's fault. And here's a picture of their use pattern map from the RMP. But there's a few problems with this approach. The data were collected earlier in the decade, so that the places weren't meeting the ecological condition scores early in the decade. And the utilization data were collected in 2009. 2 of the 5 allotments didn't even have cows in 2009. There were no cows. So they're going out and measuring how much the cows are eating. And the cows weren't there, so those passed. And they only looked at utilization of perennial species. And here's another problem, and I'm going to just tell you what it is. The not surveyed areas, and this is an allotment boundary, all of the not surveyed areas got classified as slight to no use. So they didn't go out, this is the field map, they did not look at utilization, and they reclassified it as slight use. And sure enough, the plots that failed to meet the standards in these areas that they didn't look at, it wasn't cows, because it was less than 40% use. I don't know how they did it. So anyway, lo and behold, the grazing continues on most of the monument, and these litigation-happy enviro groups who everything looks like a nail had to initiate a lawsuit this past year to try to stop this. Also, just briefly, I want to tell you about the Yuma Resource Management Plan. Yuma is hot and dry as it gets in the state. Sure enough, the latest resource management plan allows grazing to continue on all the 5 allotments that have been grazed. In 2004, the researchers looked at the landscape health, these same land health standards, and they said, oh, it's not, the land can't support perennial year-long grazing, and so let's deal with it in the land use plan. In 2009, the land use plan came out and said, oh, you know, let's look at it in the rangeland health assessments. So we can't decide in the land use plan, we need to do rangeland health assessments. So either BLM is really excited about recycling, or they're afraid to make this political decision to end grazing in lands that, you know, less than 2 inches of rain a year. So on the upside, Carcass Counting, enhanced recreational opportunities on your public lands. These cows die of starvation out there, and it's because it's feedlots. The permittees are feedlots, and they dump out thousands of cows when it greens up. The forage goes away. It's not worth it to them to collect every straggler. So you can find lots of dead cows, and I just wanted to say thank you. And here's my references, and for more information, contact me.